couple of weeks ago, John Patterson stood in front of us and reminded us that we were like the roads in Calgary, always under construction. And I think, too, we are like a piece of IKEA furniture, some assembly required. So it's June, which means we're still on step 6. And did you know that if you ask someone what the 12 steps are, step 6 is the one that they are most likely to forget? I believe that this is for a number of reasons. First, it's hard for anyone, not just addicts and alcoholics, to admit their faults. Second, when we really, and I mean really, get honest with ourselves, there are some defects that we just don't want to let go of. This is because some defects of character have become so much a part of us, and some even so ingrained in our society that we don't even recognize them as defects anymore. Why is it so important to admit our defects? Well, some argue that step 6, like steps 4 and 5, are shaming. But if we don't know what parts of us need work, then how are we ever to improve? How do we become better people? So just by a quick show of hands, how many of you want to become better people? About half. I was expecting a little more of that. So how many of you don't want to become better people? Oh, okay. So how many of you just weren't listening? The humble man makes room for progress, and the proud man believes he is already there. We need to keep our pride and our ego in check. And step 6 is actually, for me, my favorite step. And that's because I want to be a better person today than the one I was yesterday. And I often fall short of the mark, and I realize that when I do my step 10 at night. But rather than beat myself up and shame myself when I've made mistakes, I try to learn from them and improve. And I don't view it as hard work. I look at it like going to school or taking any kind of course. I want to improve. But if I don't look at what it is that I need to improve upon, how will I know if I'm doing better? Most of us want to improve in some or many areas of our lives. And sometimes that's just about more knowledge, like learning to swim or to dance or a new computer skill. And learning something like these types of things doesn't require us to identify a defect of character, so it's relatively easy to get into. But when it comes to admitting a fault, a defect of character, a shortcoming, well, that's a different story. For everyone, not just addicts and alcoholics. And there are deep-seated psychological reasons for this. And one of them is called a cognitive bias. Now, by definition, a cognitive bias is a mistake in reasoning, evaluating, or remembering, which often occurs as a result of holding on to one's preferences and beliefs regardless of contrary information. Now that sounds a lot to me like a line from How It Works. Some of us have tried to hold on to our old ideas, but the result was nil until we let go absolutely. The psychologist's definition says, regardless of contrary information. And there's definitely a lot of contrary information up to this point in our program. There's powerlessness, unmanageability, trying again and again to do it our own, blaming it on everyone else, as we find out in our step 4. The list of contrary information goes on and on. A second psychological reason for not wanting to do step 6 is called a cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance occurs when our behaviors are inconsistent with our values. So regardless of our addictions, we still, at the core of us, value certain things. It may be somewhat different for different people, but things that we value and believe in usually include honesty, integrity, family, trustworthiness, self-respect, loyalty, happiness, friendships, and authenticity. But when we're in our addiction, we don't behave like we value those things. And this creates a cognitive dissonance. So to admit in our step 6 that we lie, we push family and friends away, we aren't trustworthy, we don't live our lives with authenticity, we don't respect ourselves, and we are generally miserable, goes against what we value. Our actions are not consistent with our values and beliefs. That is another one of the reasons we don't like and forget this step. Because step 6 magnifies the double life that we have been living. Now, a few minutes ago, I said that sometimes we have defects of character that we just don't want to let go of. So let me give you an example. I have lots of people who tell me they don't like the term defects of character because it comes across harsh and shaming. Now, this term has been around in the big book terminology for 80 plus years. And these people tell me that I should use words like bad habit. So when they say that to me, I suggest to them that maybe their need to control things might be a bad habit that they should ask God to remove in their step 7. Now, usually they continue to argue that their language is better than the language that has helped millions of people, addicts and alcoholics, work through their defects of character. And I usually say something like, maybe your need to always be right is a bad habit that you need to work through as well. Now, there's a big advantage to this type of discussion for me, and that's it gives me something to work on, which is my bad habit of sarcasm. You mean to tell me mistakes were made? And this is what we're typically like when we first come into the program. We don't want to admit that we made mistakes. But by the time we get to step 4, and particularly that nasty column 4 in our inventories, where we admit we've been selfish, dishonest, fearful, and inconsiderate, our outlook on things has started to change. If we are able to work through our cognitive dissonance, we will see that we have way more character defects than just those 4 of selfish, fearful, dishonest, and inconsiderate. Now, there's a great book by Carol Tavris that's called Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me, which speaks to the difficulty we have in admitting mistakes, which are often fueled by our character defects. Now, there are sometimes character defects present which we haven't drilled down deep enough to recognize as defects. And here are some examples. Negative self-talk. By that I mean putting ourselves down with the tapes in our head that we listen to and that we buy into. Being judgmental. Now, we all know that this is a character defect, but do we recognize the number of ways and how often we do it? I want you to look back on your last week and ask yourself how many times you said or thought something bad about another person. What about thinking you're better than someone else? Or being an impulsive spender? Is there anybody here that's opinionated? Do any of you worry? Do you see that as a character defect? Because if you're worrying, you haven't got step 3 under your belt. Anybody here a perfectionist? What about a pessimist? And these are just a few examples of defects of character which we may not dig deep enough to see as defects. We develop character defects when we're in active addiction because of the disease. The disease has to survive at all costs. So we lie to protect it, we rage, we hurt those around us through our words and our actions. Also, some of us have character defects which are based on faulty upbringings. If we grow up in a family that's racist or judgmental or negative or angry, one that has a dim worldview, we might see that as normal, but it isn't healthy. And these defects can be hard to get rid of because they're so deeply ingrained. We sometimes develop character defects because of the belief or behaviors of other people that we hang around with and that we get drawn into. Do you have people in your life who constantly complain, can never find any good in anything, talk about others behind their back, that lack ambition, who are lazy, or just downright miserable to be around? Get rid of them, because you will become like them. We learned at the men's retreat that we are the average of the 5 people we hang around the most, and that deserves some thought. Think about the 5 people that you spend most of your time with. Are they negative? Don't work their program? Don't share your values? Are they mean to other people? Do you feel better after spending time with them? Or do you feel worse? Do you feel like they enrich your life? If not, get rid of them, as you're a reflection of the people that you hang around with. We also develop character defects because of what has become faulty societal norms. And what I mean by that is society in general is starting to see certain character defects as acceptable. My point is that we have to be vigilant, discerning, and intelligent about how we spend our time and what we allow to influence us. Let's take a look at how society, media, and societal norms impact our values and contribute to our defects of character. We, as addicts and alcoholics, need connection and community. That's why 12-step meetings work. But how many times when we're with other people are we texting, surfing, checking our emails, or checking our Facebook pages, and we miss the opportunity to give and receive something that we all desperately need: human contact? Is our fascination with, or dare I say it, our addiction to screen time a defect of character? Are you ever agitated when your phone rings, your partner talks to you, or someone shows up at the door when you're watching your favorite TV show? Could that be a defect of character? Do you watch TV reruns or surf the net when your boyfriend, girlfriend, or spouse or children are in the room and miss the opportunity to connect? Is that a character defect? How does media contribute to the erosion of our values and increase our character defects? We watch shows like Big Brother and Survivor that teach us that running people down, gossiping and stabbing them in the back, and winning at all costs is a good thing. We read the tabloids, even if it's just in the supermarket line. We watch Entertainment Tonight or TMZ because we've been conditioned to accept that gossiping is okay. We have world leaders calling people names, having affairs, stealing, and lying, and we start to normalize that behavior rather than looking at it, evaluating it, and identifying it as a character defect. Is it creeping into your head and into your behaviors? Of course it is, because we are constantly bombarded with it. Now here's a stat that will blow your mind. The AC Nielsen company, which is the company that does all the TV ratings, says that the average North American watches 4 hours of television per day. That's 28 hours per week, or the equivalent of 2 full months of non-stop watching per year. Which means by the time you reach age 65, you will have watched 9 years of television. With all the negative news and the horrible programming, how can it not be impacting us and making it harder for us to work on our self-improvement? Now, aside from all the defects of character you might pick up by watching TV, I think that maybe watching 9 years of television might be a character defect on its own. The slide of the baby saying, "You mean to tell me mistakes were made?" which is our denial when we first head into steps 4 through 7, gives way to acceptance. We often hear people in recovery say that we're the lucky ones because we are forced through circumstances to confront reality and admit that we make mistakes. We find a new way of living that allows us to be okay with being imperfect. And it's such a relief. Our starting place of "you mean mistakes were made" gives way to this. What did you make today? Mistakes. And I made lots of them today and yesterday, and I will tomorrow as well. And it's such a relief to be able to say that. In AA, we often say that we have 2 big books, the big book of AA and the Bible. And one of the things that I like most about the Bible is it is full of imperfect people. And it is a story of how God took imperfect people and used them for good things. In the Bible, mistakes were made, and lots of them. And that helps me to relate. Our scripture tonight is about the king of mistakes, the king of character defects, a real king, King David, the king of Israel. Like many of us, David came from humble beginnings, a shepherd boy who gained some fame by slaying the giant Goliath. As a young man, he wasn't ready to have God change his defects of character because he wasn't willing to admit that he had any. That sounds like a lot of us in our early years and when we're active in our addictions. There's nothing wrong with me. It's everybody else who has to change. This is from Psalm 26, verses 9 to 11 from the New Living Translation, which was written by King David. And he said, "Don't let me suffer the fate of sinners. Don't condemn me along with murderers. Their hands are dirty with evil schemes, and they constantly take bribes. But I am not like that. I live with integrity. So redeem me and show me mercy." King David didn't see himself like the others, like the sinners. He thought he was different. He thought he was better. I think he might have had a bit of a character defect going on at that point in his life. But just like all of us, he stumbled and he fell short of the mark. Well short. One evening from his window, David saw a beautiful woman named Bathsheba bathing, and he lusted after her and had her brought to his room, knowing that she was married, and slept with her. Now, one might say there's a few defects of character going on there, from a king who didn't see himself as being a sinner. Now it gets worse. Then he found out that he had got her pregnant. So he called for her husband Uriah, who had just come back from a military campaign, and he tried to manipulate Uriah into sleeping with his wife Bathsheba to cover up for what David had done. But instead, Uriah chose to sleep at the palace entrance with the servants. So David summoned him again the next night and asked him why he hadn't gone home. And the short answer that Uriah gave was that he didn't think that he was showing a lot of integrity to have the luxury of his home and the comfort of his wife when the other members of the army were camping in tents and out in the open. So David suggested that that night he eats and drinks with David, and David got him drunk, thinking that he would go to sleep with his wife. But instead, Uriah slept with the servants again. So David's plan to cover up the fact that Bathsheba was carrying his child had failed. So he devised a diabolical plan. Now he's covering up a character defect with a character defect. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab, who was the army's commander, and in it he wrote, "Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is the fiercest, then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die." And that is what happened. Now remember, he had written, "Don't condemn me along with murderers. Their hands are dirty with evil schemes, and they constantly take bribes. But I'm not like that. I live with integrity. So redeem me and show me mercy." Now I think David might have been struggling a bit with honesty, with his ego, with lack of humility, and about being a little bit judgmental, just to name a few character defects. Now it's interesting that there is a syndrome called Bathsheba syndrome, which is about the moral corruption of leaders, political leaders, church leaders, business leaders, and sports team leaders and coaches. And this syndrome happens for two reasons. One is the impact of gaining power over others, and two is the tendency for groups to look the other way. Now, I don't think that King David would have guessed that his defects of character would have spawned a field of psychological research. Now, it wasn't until later in David's life, when he was confronted with the sins of adultery, among other things, that he was able to say this. This is Psalm 51, verse 5. And it says, "For I was born a sinner, yes, from the moment my mother conceived me. You do not desire a sacrifice, or I would offer one. You do not want a burnt offering. The sacrifice you desire is a broken spirit. You will not reject a broken and repentant heart, O God." Now clearly, between Psalm 26 and Psalm 51, a transformation had taken place, an acknowledgement of defects of character, and that mistakes were made. This change in King David, from when he wrote Psalm 26 to when he wrote Psalm 51, was miraculous. It came as a result of taking his inventory and admitting his defects of character. God isn't looking for how good we are or how good we think we are. And that's what David was trying to convince God of in Psalm 26. What God is looking for is for us to admit and mourn over our woundedness. And that is what David was saying in Psalm 51. And God will forgive us and comfort us. It's all right there for the taking, in the big book and in the Bible. But we have to do the work. Remember, there's some assembly required.